Hello and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this very, very interesting discussion about mass vaccination in a pandemic. I am Dr. Philip McMillan. I am a physician in the United Kingdom. I have been focused on COVID-19 and talking to experts across the world for over a year. And my focus has been on autoimmunity in COVID-19, and that's something that I have shared about for a long time. Now, we've had to have a second interview, and I have never done this before because the response has been so incredible to the first interview with Geert, and I realized that we really need to dig a bit deeper about what he is saying. It's important to note that Geert, he is a top international um, developer of vaccines. So for people who think he's an anti-vaxxer, that doesn't fit. He develops them. And he has been working in this sector for over 30 years. What has caused him to speak out? We will find out. And I have the pleasure of introducing again, Geert, thank you very much for giving your time and your expertise. And I have to say to the world, thank you for joining us again, Geert.
Thanks, Philip, for having me on the program.
So wonderful. I was trying to give a little bit of insight into your background, Geert. And you said that you are 30 years in this sector. You were first, I guess, for about 10 years virology, and then after that, vaccine development. And you've worked at a number of international organizations to produce vaccines and the research and so on. Is that about correct?
Yeah, it is, Philip. But I would not too much emphasize on the institutes I've been working with and all the organizations I've been working with. What probably needs to be more emphasized is that I combine, as several other colleagues, three key disciplines that I think are essential or critical for understanding what is going on right now in the pandemic. And that is virology, immunology, and vaccinology. I mean, this is an interplay between a virus with an immune system, and we are intervening with mass vaccination. So this is essential, to have discussion with people who have this kind of background, immunology, virology, and vaccinology, to have really a very deep understanding of this very complex phenomenon that has even become more complex since our massive human intervention, infection prevention measures, and mass vaccination. It has added tremendously to the complexity now. Over.
So why did you speak out about this, Geert? And why is it that you seem to be the only voice at this level of expertise that is speaking about this? It's interesting that none of the major players have come out against you. They just have stayed very quiet. What's going on?
Well, I think, Philip, there are several different elements. First of all, like all other people, I was worried when I saw that this pandemic was not getting out of control, but that it was not easy to control the virus, and that all of a sudden we got more infectious strains, etc. And that I found very suspicious, the search of more infectious strains all of a sudden. And then I took a deep dive in this. Again, I would like to emphasize that, I'm only a small light on in this world. It's not about me. I'm, an insignificant person. There is, people who are much more brilliant in immunology, vaccinology, and also virology than I am. But there is one thing I can tell you, and that is that I've done my homework, and people who know me know that I'm a very zealous person and that I don't give up before I've really found what is going on, because this is very complex, the immunology, the virology, and the vaccinology. And as a matter of fact, I happen to be in a stage of my life where I'm completely independent, which extremely rarely happens. I mean, if you have this kind of background, and I want to say very humble, but I have done a number of interesting things. That's true. You are usually affiliated with, one or the other organization, industry, or whatever, or you have very important consultancy contracts, etc. Through some kind of coincidence, at this very stage in my life, this is not the case. So I can speak up, and I would also really like people who write me and who have credentials that are, way more important and way more impressive than mine, to speak up when they write me that, I do have a point, but that probably no one will listen to me. And I would really like to urge them to come onto the stage and to speak up as well, regardless of their affiliation, because what we are facing right now, I already told it 2 weeks ago, the pandemic for me is out of control. And if we are not going to put our heads together with people who can put a lot of weight because of their reputation, because of their credentials, I mean, who is going to intervene? Initially, I told, well, maybe, the pandemic, pretty harmless. People say, oh, is this harmless? So many Americans are dying, etc. What I meant, of course, is that the vast majority of the population did not develop any symptoms, and that it was essentially, vulnerable people, elderly people, and that, of course, we should protect those people and come with early treatment, that we can intervene early on. But now we are facing a completely different situation. We are having one pandemic after the other with all these infectious variants. So now I'm extremely worried. And now I'm saying we must intervene. We must intervene, because otherwise we are not going to get rid of these infectious variants. Nobody is telling us how on earth are we going to get rid of these infectious strains. And every second week there is a new one. And now we have already infectious strains that cannot even be detected by the current PCR methods. So people are infected, they go for a test, it's negative, and they're positive. So, I mean, we must put our heads together. And I see that the rhetoric becomes very aggressive, and it's probably because, of course, now I can speak, nobody can contradict me, that's not good. But then all these comments we are getting, it's not a constructive dialogue. We get very aggressive language, etc. People are torturing their brains to find solutions. We can only find solutions if we put our ideas and our analysis together, and we do this in a constructive way. Frankly speaking, all this rhetoric, this aggressive rhetoric, it's a luxury. We can no longer allow ourselves to have this kind of debate. It's not constructive at all.
Yeah, I understand. Now, here's an important question, Geert, and this is the challenge that I think are being faced by governments and even the World Health Organization, which you're calling to do something different. I'm going to show you quickly a picture with regards to, say, what's happening in Israel. Israel is probably the furthest along with regards to vaccination. And I've been watching their snapshot. And what you can see is that in terms of, this is about hospital new severe patients daily, even though it's up, it is gradually coming down. And critically, when you look at patients who have died, again, even though it's still up, it is consistently coming down. When you look at even, say, for instance, the UK, and you look at the UK, which is again quite far ahead, from January all the way through down to March, they were at 17,700. They're now down to 11,500. These are good numbers. How can we expect anyone to do anything different when we have a situation where it seems as though they are making progress?
Well, that's exactly, Philip, where I'm saying we need people who understand all the aspects of the pandemic and not just look at what is happening at a certain moment in time with a certain part of the population or in a certain country. The reason I'm saying this is that, per definition, a pandemic, or the dynamics of a pandemic, the dynamics of the immunology and of the viral spread in populations that are vulnerable, or in people that are vulnerable, versus people that are not vulnerable, that have a very good innate immunity, those dynamics are interrelated. So how then can we look at just only one part of the population? So of course, if you have a massive vaccination campaign that proceeds very, very fast, the virus will get a serious blow in the face, and of course the infection rates will go down, and of course the mortality and disease rates will go down. But the question is, what happens in the meantime? Can we eradicate? The infection rates go down, but we need them to get to zero. I mean, we need to eradicate these highly infectious strains. We cannot afford to live with these highly infectious strains. So what you will see in those countries is that you have a plateau. I cannot exactly say how long it will last, maybe 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, but the immune escape variants, they will establish themselves in the population, and they will give rise to a steep incline in those disease rates. And the reason I'm saying this is that if you have, for example, an immune escape, and you really want to establish that variant, for example, in cell culture, what you're going to do is to do passages. You're going to passage from one cell culture to the other, and each time you're going to put this virus under the very same pressure. It could be an antiviral, it could be antibodies, etc. So after a while, the virus gets really established to those very tough conditions for the virus, and then it has a competitive advantage, of course, and it will again replicate. So I think I understand the reasoning that people are saying, well, this is going in the good direction, but we can show many countries that despite vaccination are not doing good as well. And what we see as well is that where vaccination rates are progressing or increasing much more slowly, so where the virus got also a blow, but not as serious as, for example, in Israel or in the UK, the virus will recover much more easily. We, for example, in Belgium, where vaccination campaigns are moving rather slowly, we have seen a plateau for about 6 weeks or 6 days or maybe a week or 10 days. And then people were already talking about relaxing, the measures, the prevention measures, etc. And what we see right now, after 10 days, is again an increase. It will not be as steep, I guess, as in the UK and as in Israel, but it is already very, very worrisome. So the virus is going to come back. I mean, that is very clear. They're highly infectious, and I have such a problem, people not acknowledging that despite the fact there is clear proof that the virus is encountering on several different occasions suboptimal immune pressure, that there would be no immune escape. Look, if you look, for example, already the disinfection prevention measures, we have seen that all these variants have mutations that strongly converge towards the S protein and domains in the S protein that are responsible for increased infectivity. So this is not at random, this are selected mutations. So I think rather than following what the curves exactly are doing on a daily basis, I'm always saying, like, you look at the stock market, I think what is going to be increasingly important is to see when in countries, despite vaccination, you get more and more infectious variants, whether those selected mutations are going to converge even further to the receptor binding domain, which is, of course, the most, the strongest domain in terms of binding to the receptor. Whether we have, despite vaccination, further convergence of these mutations, of the selected mutations to this domain, I think this is a very clear signal that there is very, very dramatic immune escape, selective immune escape inside the most strongly binding domain within the S protein.
So when it comes to the reality for general people who are watching with us, the question that keeps on coming up is, this seems to be discouraging people from taking a vaccine. So for the vaccine hesitant, the people who are not quite sure, the people who are not quite completely against vaccination, whenever they hear anything like this, they think to themselves, I am not going to take this vaccine. Is that what we want to be saying to them?
Let me think how to address this question, because, of course, if I So I can only answer this question in scientific terms, and confronting people with reality, we are seeing that increasingly the antibodies in the vaccine cannot completely neutralize the infectious variants. And that is very logical, because the spike protein in the infectious variants is increasingly different from the S protein that is comprised within the vaccine. So the first consequence of this is, of course, that you may shed more virus, well, not more virus than usual, but more virus than if the neutralizing antibodies were directed against a homologous strain or variant, exactly the same that is in the vaccine. Then you may still have some viral shedding, but it will be very, very little and very short-lived. The more the variant is different, the more, of course, the virus will be able to replicate at the portal of entry, and the more it will be shed. So what I'm saying is that by vaccinating and having on a background of highly infectious strains circulating, we are increasingly turning vaccinated people into people that are potential spreaders of the virus. So that is one thing. And now, what is the second stage? Will the antibodies still be able to protect against disease? Well, you have to realize that making somebody ill, making the individual ill, that is what the virus wants to do, because that is where it can guarantee its perpetuation. Because when you are ill, you shed virus in higher quantities, higher concentration, and for a longer time, then you are just shedding, but you don't get the disease. So the virus will definitely push and try to escape till it has also come over that barrier, of making people ill. And what I'm hearing today is that already in a nursing home in I think it was in the US, people are fully vaccinated, and already a number of them got disease, and I think some of them got even in the hospital. So that is a matter of time. So what I'm telling to people is simply, look, this is the science. If people say this guy is completely wrong, because immune escape does not exist, even if we are dealing with variants that are no longer a good match with the antibodies. And that is especially where I'm calling up to people who are saying, yeah, Geert, you do have a point, but who don't speak up. It's like I'm the only one realizing this. So that is one thing. And the other thing then is, then you have to think, well, and this is something, another molecular aspect that people have been criticizing, that I'm saying, okay, the specific antibodies induced by natural infection or by the vaccine, they have a higher affinity for the spike protein than the natural antibodies. And so in terms of binding to the receptors, these specific antibodies, although their affinity may be much lower because the virus is no longer the same, or the spike, as in the vaccine, they will still be able to outcompete the natural antibodies from binding and neutralizing the virus. And so that is the reason why these natural antibodies are, so to say, bypassed. The natural antibodies are very, very important because they do have this variant non-specific coverage. They can deal with any COVID variant. They can deal with any coronavirus, right? But of course, as I've always been saying, they have no immunological memory, so they need to be trained, etc. But what I'm saying is that these antibodies, even though their protection in terms of protection against the disease will diminish and will, according to my humble opinion, vanish when there is resistance, they will still be able to outcompete natural antibodies. And people who don't believe this, well, I have the publications there on our website where there is even measurement of dissociation constants, dissociation constant between an antigen-specific antibody and IgM, multimeric antibodies. And people are saying, well, the multimeric antibodies, there are 5 or 6 or 7, so they can bind at 5 or 6 different places, whereas the monomeric antigen-specific antibody can only bind at one place. these scientists need to understand that this is a completely different type of binding. I'm not going to go into the molecular detail, but this is multivalent binding. These IgMs recognize the surface of the virus as a whole. It's high avidity, weak affinity for S protein. For every single of the S proteins, the affinity is very low, but in terms of the avidity for the whole virus, it's big. But what counts here is the affinity for S, because it's the S that is responsible for binding to the receptor and hence for the infectiousness. So in terms of the infectiousness, those natural antibodies are outcompeted by the higher affinity antigen-specific, S-specific antibodies. I know this is complex, but that's why I'm saying we need people who understand biophysics, who understand this type of bindings, who understand immunology, who understand the virology, and who understand vaccines. I mean, then we can have a very focused discussion, and all the rest, frankly speaking, I mean, it's not constructive. And I'm only a small light. I'm saying there is much more brilliant people in each of these disciplines than I am, but I've done my homework. That is something, that's maybe my only merit.
And so when you mention, one of the other questions I keep getting asked is that when you say, or when you said using a prophylactic vaccine in the middle of the pandemic, you differentiate that from, say, a sterilizing vaccine that prevents infection.
Yeah. Huh. Mm.
Hello? Hi, Geert.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened. I just seemed to disappear. I'm
Yeah.
back.
Okay. So let's respond to your question with regard to the sterilizing immunity and the prophylactic vaccines. Um, I guess what I'm just saying is that if you can, and frankly speaking, there is only very few vaccines that can do this, and the primarily, I would say, live vaccines or live attenuated vaccines, is to really prevent replication of the virus. So you immunize people, and the antibody response is such that the virus has no chance, or maybe just for a very short time, to replicate, and then it's get completely eliminated. Frankly speaking, this is also what is happening with COVID naturally in asymptomatically infected people, people who don't develop symptoms. So now, if you cannot do this, you can, of course, have a vaccine that mounts a very strong antibody response, for example, so that by the time you encounter the virus, you have, we call this a humoral immune protection, high antibody titers, that will also, of course, diminish replication of the virus, that can protect you against symptoms, etc. But the problem is, if you go with this type of vaccines, I would say, in the midst of a pandemic, then, and you massively vaccinate people, whereas you cannot prevent the infection, and that is the problem right now. We are, as soon as we started, or from the very beginning, when we started mass vaccination, we were already dealing with highly infectious strains. We were already dealing with variants. And so if then, of course, the variant does not match very well with the antibodies, but you increase the pressure, you increase the immune pressure by massively vaccinating people, then you have a situation where the virus can still replicate. And I fully agree with all these people who say, yeah, well, the shedding is diminished, etc. Of course, but it can still replicate to a substantial degree, and you put it under high immune pressure. And then when this virus then infects the next person, the likelihood that this next person is also going to experience, a high level of antibodies, but antibodies that do not prevent the replication, then it gets more and more established. So that is why, so the difference is that in a pandemic, and when you massively vaccinate, you will immediately generate a high immune pressure. And so the virus will go from one person to another, and very often encountering this high immune pressure, that's how the immune escape variants get established. If you don't have this, and if you are just in a normal situation where there is no pandemic, of course, this will not happen. You will not all of a sudden, within a relative short period of time, put a big part of the population under a high immune pressure. And so immune escape is not, an escape may always happen, but it's not going to be systematically established, because you don't have all the time the same pressurizing conditions. In this case, it's immune pressure. So that is why these vaccines can be perfectly used. And I am always been the first to say this, outside of a pandemic, of course, but not in the midst of a pandemic. That is, and we are not going to be able to catch up. Of course, if in the midst of a pandemic, all of a sudden we could immunize 95% of the people, let's say almost at the same day, we may have an impact that is sufficient for the virus to no longer be able to replicate or to spread.
And do you think that what we're seeing now with almost vaccine hoarding by first world countries is going to contribute to this problem more for the developing world? Is it going to make it worse for countries that don't have access to the vaccine?
You mean the fact that we are, through vaccination, breeding variants is going to make it more dramatic for countries that have no protection at all because they have no access to the vaccines? Well, I think simply, of course, I mean, if we have import of highly infectious variants, I mean, the pandemic is going to be more dramatic in a sense that more people will be affected. I mean, there's also something where there is confusion, where I'm saying more infectious. It does not necessarily mean that it's more deadly or that you are getting more severely ill. You have to remember, more infectious means that the binding to the receptor is much stronger, okay? But once the virus gets inside the cell, I mean, everybody is playing the same game, more or less, right?
Yeah.
So that is not, but of course, if the virus gets in, and all of a sudden, compared to the original strain, you now have a variant, instead of, making people ill, of infecting them 10 people within one day, you will infect 100 or 1,000 people. So it's going to be, faster. That means that you will much faster, it will take much less time to reach a high degree of viral spread and infection in the population. And that is where I'm afraid that then the people who have good innate immunity will see their antibodies suppressed, their natural antibodies suppressed, because I've explained this last time, the likelihood that somebody who is asymptomatically infected has a short-lived surge in antibodies, because that's what happened in people who have asymptomatic infected, have a short-lived surge in antibodies, that short-lived surge may outcompete their natural antibodies. And the higher the infection rate in the population, the higher likelihood that somebody at that very moment hit or get reinfected for a second time by the virus. And then, of course, they are more susceptible. So that is,
yeah, so in terms of this, because one of the other questions is suppose the principle that you're concerned about, I mean, there are variants, but suppose we don't see that then happening with vaccination. What are the chances that this is a small risk, a medium risk, or a high risk that the driving of the variants will occur with vaccination?
I'm not sure, Philip, I got it, because you were saying, suppose we don't vaccinate.
No, what I mean is that, so we're doing the vaccination. There's no guarantee that the vaccination will definitely drive variants. Is there a guarantee? What chance do you think? Is it very likely, a bit likely, not so likely?
Well, I mean, each time you have, so what is happening if you vaccinate, these are, we rely primarily on the S antibodies, right? And people will say, yeah, there's also T cells. And I fully agree. Of course I agree, because you don't have a mature antibody response without T helper cells, etc. And at the end, when people get a disease and they cure out the disease, of course you will have CTL responses involved, etc. But primarily to prevent and to prevent people from getting the disease in the first place, we rely on T help dependent, if you like, S antibodies. But these antibodies, so they bind to the receptor, and the virus, these antibodies bind to the virus, and the virus binds to the receptor. So when the binding to the receptor becomes stronger, and that is what highly infectious variants do, the binding becomes stronger, it's much more easy for the receptor to outcompete the vaccinal antibodies for the virus. So in other words, the virus is going to bind much stronger to the receptor than that the virus is going to bind to the antigen-specific antibodies. So that is why during the vaccination, when you vaccinate, the virus can overcome the binding of the S-specific antibodies to the virus, which would normally prevent the virus from binding. But if the virus increases its binding strength for the receptor, then it overcomes this. So I think, and if this has no credibility, that is why I'm advising people should look at what is happening now with the infectious variants that emerge, after we have started the mass vaccination campaigns. Are these mutations now selected primarily in the receptor binding domain to ensure much stronger binding of the virus to the receptor, so that this binding becomes now much stronger than binding of the antibodies to the virus? Because then what is winning, the winner is the binding of the virus to the receptor, and the antibodies will just be completely outcompeted. So that is what I'm saying. If this theory is not acceptable, we should please look, rather than looking at infection rates that are declining and mortalities, etc., what is the evolution of the infectious variants that are now emerging in the midst of these mass vaccination campaigns? When they are, converging to this receptor binding domain, we cannot say, well, this is coincidence, this is not selected, this has nothing to do with immune escape. I mean, that is for me the most compelling scientific proof.
So when we are where we are today, so I mean, this has gotten so much attention that people are duly anxious about what happens. Where do we go next? If this is right, and we're seeing more variants occurring across the world, and we're seeing younger and younger people getting infected, what do we do? Are we kind of back where we were a year ago in March 2020? Are we worse off than where we were a year ago in March 2020?
Well, I hate to play the drama queen, but I think we are worse off. And as I was saying, I think we need to intervene because, Philip, as you were pointing out correctly, we are in a situation where we have these emerging infectious variants. I mean, all the time. I don't know how many we have right now. I don't follow this in detail, but I hear that it is really very, very worrisome, especially since we are having variants that cannot be detected by our PCR tests, etc. So we have that situation, as you were pointing out. Now it's a lot of young people getting the disease. Nobody dares to predict where this is going. And look at the curves in all different countries, with and without mass vaccination. I mean, we have so many different factors right now. It depends on the whole evolution, depends on which are the predominant variants in that particular country. What is their vaccination strategy? How fast do they proceed with their vaccination? Do they vaccinate first the elderly and then the youngsters, or do they vaccinate everybody together? So there's so many factors that influence this. And frankly speaking, I have this strong feeling that everything is out of control and that nobody is really understanding where this is going. Nobody is giving an answer. How are we going to get rid of these highly infectious strains? It's not going to go spontaneously. Nobody is telling anything about when this pandemic, will come to a stable situation where the virus becomes endemic. At the beginning, people were saying, well, ultimately this will then degenerate and become a common cold. I don't hear this anymore. I think nobody, believes that this is going to be the case. So there is so many uncertainties, so many things that are completely vague, where there is no really an understanding or a guidance of what people should do. It's okay. We have more and more cases. Okay, we're going to tighten up the measures, and then we see the curve reaches a plateau. Okay, we will loosen or we will relax the measures again, and ultimately, that is my personal really conviction. We will be facing catastrophic inclines in these rates, and then what will happen? Of course, and that is the last resort. It's lockdowns. But even with lockdowns, we're not going to solve this, of course, because the virus is not going to go away during the lockdown. And as soon as you will again relax the measures, I mean, this thing will come back. So we are kind of like, from one day to another, trying to mitigate the situation without thinking about a radical and a sustainable solution on how to get rid of these highly infectious variants. It's no longer the quite harmless original COVID strain that we are facing. All this, every single of these variants could be responsible for a pandemic. It's unusual. It's unusual during a natural pandemic that you see all of a sudden highly infectious strain. I explained this last time. The virus will always find a part of the population where it can get to because of declining immunity, be it innate or adaptive, without any need for the virus to become more infectious. That's no longer the case right now.
This is an interesting point somebody says, is that it sounds as though we have intervened in the pandemic and we could have disastrous consequences, either intended or unintended. Is that about a reasonable perspective that you feel at the moment?
Well, I'm very glad that somebody is asking this question. I would say, if we don't do anything, that's what I think is going to happen. Unless, and that will happen, of course, if things become too dramatic, there will be lockdowns. Only solution, lockdowns. We all know this is not a solution. This could be, a mitigation for the short term, but it's certainly not a solution. So, and that is why I'm saying, whereas I was not necessarily convinced that when the pandemic began as a natural pandemic, that we really needed to intervene with all kinds of measures, besides, of course, taking good care of vulnerable people, emphasizing early treatment, and not waiting till people are so sick that we need to hospitalize them and have them on these mechanical ventilators. So, but now that we have these highly infectious strains and that we do have these escape mutants, we must intervene. There's no way around. We must intervene, and therefore it is very, very important that we think about a plan. And I mean, I'm willing to contribute to this, because I've been torturing also my brain on how could we get out of this? How could we find a solution that really makes sense and that is a sustainable thing? The lockdowns and tightening the measures and then relaxing them again, and closing schools and then opening them again, and everybody gets confused. I mean, this is not a strategy. This is panic. This is chaos, right?
And so then when we look at the general principle, so I'm going to now take you, Geert, as speaking out. I'm putting you in charge of the global international health organization, which would be the WHO, and you are now going to be leading governments. Would you therefore recommend that they stop vaccination?
Well, if one stops vaccination, it's not to say we stop vaccination and we just look what's happening. That cannot be. I mean, I think it would be part certainly of the solution, but that in its own right will, for God's sake, not be sufficient. It will not be sufficient just to stop this mass vaccination, but with the current vaccines, continuing this mass vaccination, all we are going to do is to breed more and more infectious variants. I mean, so what I think would be worthwhile investigating, and I'm not saying that is the thing, and for sure, there is not going to be one single solution. It's going to be a combination of a number of measures. But I think it would be worthwhile to explore whether we can, for example, have, I've mentioned this several times also on the website, a finger prick test where we could test young people, or people in good health, test whether they have antigen-specific antibodies. They have not been ill. So far they have at most been asymptomatically infected, but the chance that they are sitting on antibodies becomes increasingly higher because due to the circulation of these highly infectious strains, there is a higher likelihood that they have gotten in contact and have this surge in antibodies. As I'm trying to explain all the time, when you have this surge in antibodies, they outcompete your natural antibodies, and that is problematic. So you cannot measure the natural antibodies. People are doing this. This is very complex. We still don't know exactly where these antibodies in the body are synthesized, the natural antibodies. So it's still a very mysterious part, but we do know that they are very functional. We do know that they are functional and work against all these variants. But instead of measuring those, what we could do is measure the antibodies that prevent them from doing their job. And these are then the antigen-specific antibodies. And with a finger prick test, of course, the test should be reliable. Every person in good health, every young or older people in good health that have been asymptomatically infected, so they are very often not aware because maybe they had a little bit of a sore throat or mild symptoms or no symptoms at all, then you don't even know, could measure whether they have antibodies. If they have antibodies, we know within 6 weeks, maximum 8 weeks, these antibodies are completely gone. And you're seronegative, your natural antibodies are no longer inhibited. You are protected against all variants. And that would give a chance to our young and healthy people, at least, to come out, to get their immunity trained and to monitor themselves during periods where they may be at risk. I'm not saying this is all true, what I'm saying, but it's an idea. I think it's something we need to discuss. It's something we need to explore, because remember, if we could free up our young people, I mean, this is going to be a huge relief. Now, with regard to the vulnerable people who do have these antibodies that may still be partially functional or no longer functional, they are, of course, very vulnerable. And I think we need to protect those people with the prevention measures that we know, not in the long term, but simply to save time, to buy time that is what we should do, I think, because they are really very vulnerable. They cannot, there is a risk when they encounter the virus. They have innate immunity that is very, very weak, especially the elderly, and their functional antibodies or their antigen-specific antibodies from the vaccine or the natural antibodies are no longer really neutralizing the variants. That these people need to be very careful. We need to protect them. That is for sure. In the meantime, we need to find something, and that a vaccine, or call it something else, but that does have sterilizing immunity that can eradicate these highly infectious variants. And I think that's a situation that would give a perspective. But people, who have the knowledge in these different fields need to put their heads together.
So do we need, as a world, to accept that there may be a lot of people who die in the next phase of this pandemic? Is that realistic? Not to be frightening or dramatic, but we do have to start thinking in a different way if we're going to shift out of the situation. We can't do what we have been doing before and not made any progress. Do we have to learn to face the pandemic and not run away from it?
Well, I think we can. Before we get to a situation, let's assume that we would manage to develop a vaccine that has this sterilizing immunity. For sure, we cannot deploy it as of tomorrow, right? It will take time. In the meantime, we will need to face the pandemic, but we can mitigate. I'm emphasizing the huge progress that has been made, for example, with regard to early treatment. And, I've been speaking, as you know, what many may have seen, and there is other experts in this field, etc., with Professor McMillan. And some people may say, yeah, this guy is making cocktails and, is this all approved? And does this, well, at least he's doing something. I mean, he has 85% of success with his treatment. 85% of people who get, this COVID do not need to be hospitalized because of this early efficient treatment. So that is fabulous. We can do this, and this is not expensive, can be scaled up. Most of these drugs are already approved, etc. Okay, some are off-label use, but I mean, it's all there. Prevention measures, of course, for the vulnerable, for the youngster. Let's see whether we can have this kind of kit. So we make this the world, again, in a viable environment till we have developed. But at the same time, of course, I mean, it will be inevitable. But if we don't do this, Philip, what is going to happen is that very soon our health system may crash, and if that occurs, I mean, then you even have people who will die completely needlessly because treatment could be. If we are taken by surprise, that is the worst thing. I think things will go pretty fast because now we have many variants. We have been suppressing a lot. I mean, the escapes are well established. But if we are not, if we continue like we are doing like now, we look from day to day what the girls are doing. I mean, and just vaccinating, that is not sufficient. We need to anticipate things, because if you're taken by surprise when things go fast, then it is a disaster. Then it is a catastrophe.
And any thoughts on some of the newer developments that probably have been delayed, like the oral or nasal vaccines to prevent infection in the nose and the mouth, to hopefully reduce spread to either others and to the lungs? Is that feasible?
Well, I mean, the thing I've been thinking about, and it's also a matter of debate. As you know, the pandemics where we have been very successful and where we managed to really eradicate the virus, we had vaccination campaigns with live viruses, live attenuated viruses. I'm thinking about the eradication of smallpox. I'm thinking of, polio is not fully eradicated, but we got dramatic successes and very successful vaccination campaigns when we were using the oral live attenuated polio vaccine. So, I mean, live vaccines are certainly very powerful. To your point, they stimulate mucosal immunity. Of course, if you apply this on a mucosal surface, you have induction of cellular immunity, humoral immunity. I mean, you have like all the arms of the immune system activated at the right place, at the portal of entry. So that is something that I think could have been considered at the beginning of the pandemic, but you always have a kind of problem in a sense that you know for sure, even if you have a live attenuated vaccine, that in case you immunize a person who is not in very good health, who has a weakened immune system, is immunocompromised, or who has a genetic deficiency in the innate immune system, that there is a risk that this person may become ill. We had with polio, it was much more worrisome. We had even people who, as a consequence of the vaccination, got poliomyelitis. So now this was like one in, I don't remember exactly, 200,000 or even more, or 500,000 people. But still, it's very worrisome if you know, well, it can happen. It's very rare, but it can happen. So I think in our modern world, it's no longer acceptable that we use a vaccine, even though it would be very efficient, if there is a chance that somebody, as a consequence of the vaccine, would get ill. Whereas I think with coronavirus, we could immediately treat that person. This person would not even proceed to severe illness or whatever. But it's like, okay, I mean, you get an injection. Ideally, nothing happens. It's highly purified, and some of these vaccines only comprise, in fact, the S protein. We forget, of course, about when a live vaccine induces many more immune responses, interferons and mucosal antibodies and systemic antibodies and cellular immune responses, etc. So that is a consideration that that we may still have. I've not gone into the detail how feasible would it be at this point in time to start doing oral or mucosal vaccination with an attenuated coronavirus vaccine. We have all these dominant strains, these highly infectious strains. It could well be that it's no longer possible, because also, like with poliovirus, people who were then vaccinated shedded the virus for some time. They could, in fact, infect other people, and by doing that, these other people were automatically immunized as well. I think now with these prevailing highly infectious and dominant strains, that is something we can no longer rely upon. I don't know whether it would be feasible. It's an idea. I think we need to think about this. We also need to think about how much time would it take. We have the common cold viruses, of course. We could not, I think, start vaccination with the common cold viruses, because we know that common colds can, especially also in elderly people or immunocompromised people, still cause, even pneumonia. I mean, rarely, but it can. So it would need to be more attenuated, for example. So, but there is a number of considerations. It's not that we are like completely helpless. There are interventions that could be considered, and also interventions that we could use, I guess, to buy time, and to intervene in a way that is scientifically justified and that gives a perspective.
And one of the things that I heard you say that I thought was very important is that we don't seem to have learned the lesson of giving credence to how important it is to be healthy. Is that something that we have missed to emphasize properly during this pandemic?
Yeah, well, not just during this pandemic, Philip. I think it's it's something that we have indeed completely neglected in our modern lifestyle, where everybody's having a lot of stress, not enough sleep, plenty of issues, concerns, sorrow, where everything needs to go very fast. We don't really care about what we are eating. Even on vacation, we are stressed. We are on our mobile phones all the time, on our computers. And of course, it's also a society where there's a lot of abuse of still smoking, drugs, alcohol, etc. And I mean, it's very well proven. I mean, this is simply science. There are publications how well a healthy lifestyle and a good health correlates, yes, with innate immunity, right? So again, I'm repeating myself. I would love to see the statistics, and I'm only thinking about two criteria: people who have no overweight, because being obese is very clearly a predisposing factor, people who have no overweight and do regular exercise. Show me the statistics of the people who contracted severe COVID disease, right? In that part of the population. I'm only talking about two criteria that contribute to good health and a healthy lifestyle. So
Mm.
but of course, advocating for this type of, caution, it's not something that can easily commercially be exploited. And
Yeah.
I mean, I come from industry, and it's important. It's important, of course, that you have an economy and that you make products and that people pay for them, etc., etc. But this doesn't mean that what nature has given us, and what is, I think, the most important tool, especially, it becomes very clear right now, because what I'm saying is the natural antibodies and the natural immunity followed by NK cells are the only tools that are broadly effective against all the variants, all the coronaviruses even, right? So it's so precious. It's so precious. We cannot ignore this. We cannot neglect this. And we need to take good care of this.
Wonderful. Listen, Gert, I really appreciate. We're coming up to probably about an hour. There've been so many comments that we probably
Mm,
can't deal with all of them.
mm.
And I think that what I want to do, Gert, is that I again listen to your passion. I can see the fact that you're independent of what's happening around you, which is why you're probably brave enough to speak up about this. But you are right. We need a team of people who will be able to pull solutions together from where the world seems to be hanging on the brink or on the edge of a precipice. How do you see something like that happening in real terms? Is that feasible as your going away wish?
So, Philip, if there is one thing we humans are not at all good at, it's in preparing ourselves. I mean, there have been years and years already of debate about preparedness to pandemics and epidemics and all these type of things, and many organizations and reorganization of WHO and setting up additional structures and still look what is happening right now. I mean, we are facing a pandemic that is even getting worse, according to my humble opinion, through all this unthoughtful human intervention, not knowing who the enemy is, not knowing how to use our weapon, not knowing what the strategy is. And this is because we are not prepared. And I don't know, this is, I think, inherent to our nature, I guess, that we only see need for action when the problem is there. Now, in many cases, that's fine if you can still manage the problem. But here we are talking about an order of magnitude that is something which will not be easy to manage, and it's something which is going on all over the world. And what I see is that every single country has its own strategy, as if it were a Belgian or an American or a German or a UK pandemic. It's, for God's sake, it's all the same. So the first thing that we need to do is that we need, I think, to have a kind of community where people dare to speak up, regardless of their affiliation, regardless of all the constraints that they are facing. That is not easy to do, and it's only going to happen when things really start to explode. I would wish it would happen before that. And then I think what we need is a high degree of solidarity. I mean, it cannot be anymore that everybody's thinking about himself, or every country is thinking about what is in my country, and all this, sorry that I'm saying this bullshit with passports and all these type of things, where we're stigmatizing people, where it's a lot of discrimination for something that is not even scientifically proven. We give people hope where there's no scientific rationale, instead of having a debate, instead of really deploying some really solidarity, that we say, okay, the first thing that comes now is our health. And I would say also, well, I'm not going to dramatize too much. I'm not saying the further existence of humankind. We will continue. Our species will, of course, continue. But if we don't come up with a solution, if we don't hold together, we are going to face massive losses. And that is really my fear. And I'm scared, and I'm scared because of, also my kids who are growing up in this kind of world where we have, with the current pandemic, nobody, no authority is like saying, okay, guys, enough is enough. Now we really need to come up with a solution that everybody believes in and that can be explained in simple words, so that everybody who is now getting the shot can understand what is going on and can make really an informed decision. Do I want to do this or not? It's your body, it's your health. Nobody has a right to intervene in your body. But of course, before you can take the decision, you need to be informed. And it's our duty, the scientific community, who else, to inform people and to have a very open debate and to try all together to find a solution that is really constructive, that is sustainable, and that really enables us to go back to our previous lives. That is my opinion.
Wonderful, wonderful, Geert. Geert, again, I thank you very much on behalf of the audience that have been listening to you. I would encourage everyone to go and take a look at Geert's research on his website. Could you tell us the website information, Geert?
Yeah, well, the website, and again, it's not about myself, but yeah, we need to have a website, and it happened to have my name is www, and then my name, Geert Vanden Bossche, all written in one word, .org. So www.geertvandenbossche.org.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Geert. Just hang on the line for me just for a minute as we say goodbye to everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I'm sure we'll have further conversations in the future.